This podcast is part of a series of audio recordings of assorted philosophical texts from uniquephilosophy.co.uk. The topic of alchemy is one that has a special significance to me. The place it has taken in my heart is probably down to the relation that it has to several of my persistent interests. Namely, I was always interested in the fantasy genre as a teenager, alchemy being a mystical element of almost every instance of it. In addition to this, as my interests morphed over time to include the mathematical sciences and philosophy, alchemy appealed to a wisening, more knowledge-curious side of me. One small portion of alchemy concerns plants and preparations, extending backwards in time to shortly after the practice began in ancient Egypt. This culture involves some of the earliest examples of a scientific method for crafting medicines, but the art was riddled with superstition and pseudoscience. A great book on this is The Alchemy Reader for those interested. It's not difficult to understand how plants worked their way into the medicinal world though. Before the advent of synthetic chemicals, almost all the tried and tested medicines that we used were in one way or another extracted from plants. Opium, for instance, is a powerful painkiller that is readily available in the secretion of the opium poppy. Willow trees have also demonstrated their value, and the bark has been used for millennia to indirectly yield aspirin through mixture with vinegar, a favourite of alchemists through the ages. You can clearly see the similarities between the herbal toils described above and the attitudes towards plants today for their benefits to health. But the alchemists had a misunderstanding with plants that has died slowly as science has progressed. It was the belief of many alchemists that likeness accompanies synchronicity. That if a plant resembles an organ, for example, it must have some sort of effect on that organ. It may well have been that this notion caused a bias in how people interpreted the results of the preparations. After all, clinical studies weren't a thing in the 1500s. But it's a shocking reality that things like this were common during that time. Much how suspects of crimes may have been judged unfairly based on their resemblance to stereotypical criminals. It wasn't the herbalism that encouraged me to study alchemy at first. It was the simplicity and comprehensibility of its foundations, allegedly chiselled into the emerald tablets in around the time of the ancient Egyptians. I'll never forget my first physics lesson in college, where our tutor proclaimed before the class that he was a practicing alchemist. After he announced that it was in fact a real thing, a current thing, and all about the origins of the subject, my attention was fixed. I started pulling up as many articles from the web as possible and having frequent conversations with my tutor about the concepts contained within them. Before long, I had my first book on alchemy that, coincidentally, my own father had read by his own volition when he was my age. I can't actually remember whether it was a Christmas or birthday present, but either way, I do remember the excitement when I examined the cover for the first time after receiving the book by surprise. The book was Real Alchemy by Robert Bartlett. Contained within it were all the instructions to make your own herbal preparations at home by what was known as the spagyric method. An odd fact that this book revealed was that alchemists based a lot of their art on the framework of astrology, leading to yet more subtleties and diversions in their pursuit of medicine. Still, the book radiated practical information, and at the back of the book was a list of commonly used medicinal plants, their potential use cases, and instructions on when to harvest them. I was in love. It was soon after reading through the pages of this book that I decided to give some of the recipes a go. The spagyric process is easy to follow, but applicable to almost every plant and with endless improvability. This meant that there was a serious element of creativity and choice, and that suited my personality. After running some basic tests on foraged berries in a glass bottle over the hob, I decided to hunt down a specific plant for a potion I had planned to be of utmost quality. I summoned my brother to help with the task, offered him what two children would call a generous amount of money in exchange for the harvest, and then sent him off to find some wild carrot. Now, if you're acquainted with plants, then you'll be anticipating what happened next. I already knew that the carrot had a deadly twin, poison hemlock, that could cause tremors, paralysis, and even death if handled improperly. I warned him of this before hiring him, of course, but was sadly unprepared for the turnout of events. He came back, trip after trip, hauling bunches of what I thought was wild carrot back to our garden. I then had the job of hanging it on the washing line to dry out. Not long into the activity, my brother reported itches and red rashes on his forearms, just where his gloves ended. It was evidently from the plants, but he seemed perfectly healthy and didn't mind the possibility that he was handling one of the deadliest plants in the United Kingdom, so he continued to finish. When the job was complete, after all my money was gone and he was presumably tired, itchy and fed up, we discussed the course of the rash. The key difference between the poisonous hemlock and the perfectly friendly carrot was that the leaves differed in shape. Strangely enough, the plant that he had been harvesting the entire time had vastly different leaves to both. In all truth, I just assumed that wild carrot had a mutant subspecies with twisted leaves. The reality, though, was interesting. It turns out that there was another look-alike, the common giant hogweed. It's a pest in the United Kingdom and a danger to society. There are incidents of children running through stretches of the weed and falling victim to its defences. The rashes that my brother got on his arm were photoactivated toxins that the plant had released and that had burnt his skin in the hot sun. I must have let out a sigh of relief when I realised this, but confusing two plants with each other was a mistake I was determined to never make again. I activated my inner nerd and set to work producing the prettiest and most informative spreadsheet of taxonomy that a teenager could ever want. I created the following columns: order, family, genus, species, common name, properties, wild sample, and chemical profile, which made a spreadsheet that, once colour-coded, allowed me to transparently see the relationships between different plants and what their effects were on people. Being a game of memory, it was tough at first to be familiar with all the families, but I quickly became a font of knowledge on herbal relationships. I felt like a family law solicitor for plants, always understanding what one plant meant to another and laying down the facts. My love of plants blossomed, and I strived to incorporate them more into my life. To this day, I still point out Amaryllidaceae and Apiaceae on walks. Anyone that has cooked with me will know to add something from Lamiaceae or Solanaceae to make their meal pop. I even feel sorry for plants when eating them sometimes due to the bond I have gathered with them and the characters that they have become in my mind. Alas, my affair with plants is not what it used to be, though I will always keep a welcoming seat at my table for houseplants and a healthy herb garden. I may try growing cocoa next. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. For more podcasts and content, visit uniquephilosophy.co.uk and subscribe to my newsletter. Or visit Unique Philosophy on YouTube and subscribe to my channel.